2 o'clock, so I think we'll get started again. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Ria Cheen. I'm one of the staff here at Liverpool Hope and part of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies. I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague Owen Barden and the final seminar in this Disability and the Emotions seminar series. So during one of the breaks earlier on, I asked Owen how he'd like to be introduced and if there was anything I should mention in particular about the project or his work. And he said, no, just say, this is Owen, don't expect too much. So, without further ado, this is Owen, don't expect too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ria. Thank you to David for giving me the opportunity to finish the afternoon and indeed the seminar series, which has been fantastic. This is I'm coming to the end of my 6th year here at Liverpool Hope, and Professor Newport mentioned earlier how generous David is in supporting his colleagues, and one of the first things I did when I got here was get an invitation from David asking me to present at one of these seminars. And he's sort of consistently provided me with opportunities ever since, and I know that he does that for everybody in the team. He doesn't particularly like me, thank you, David, and thanks to you guys for sticking around. I have been working for about the last 18 months on a kind of history project. So. I've been invited to contribute to the Cultural History of Disability book series, which is coming out next year on the Bloomsbury. Is it 6 or 8 volumes, David? I can never remember. 6, it's like Henry VIII's Wives. I can never remember how many. So 6 books coming out next year. So, and in relation to that, I've been doing some research, some archival research, particularly into the history or around the history of learning difficulties. So it's some of that work that I'll be presenting on today. So around this time last year at the CCDS conference, I gave a paper then about some of the earlier work that I'd done, and that paper sort of concentrated on the interwar period really, and things around eugenics, particularly around the 1920s and early 1930s. So what I'm going to say today won't cover that period, and I know a lot of you will be disappointed that I kind of covered a lot of the theoretical and methodological stuff in that first paper, so I'm not going to do that today either. But that along with the other panel, plenary panels and the keynotes is available on our YouTube channel, should you want to investigate any of that further. But what I'm going to do is expand upon a couple of themes that have been touched upon already. So Trish mentioned earlier on about the cost of institutionalisation, and how that's not perhaps been given sufficient attention, the role of institutions in supposedly protecting disabled people from the outside world, rather than perhaps the other way around. So I'm going to be picking up on those kinds of themes, and I'm going to be concentrating on 2 main periods. So I'll just begin by outlining the structure of the presentation, the main presentation. What I will do is I will start by taking us back to the 1870s and the beginnings, or the early decades at least, of asylums, and the beginnings of what I am terming here, or what I've nicked from Foucault, who hasn't? The archipelago of confinement. So I'll think about the origins of that. I'll explain what I mean by the archipelago of confinement. And then in the main bulk of the presentation, I'll focus on 2 periods separated by 100 years. So that's around the 1910s, so the early 20th century, and around about now, so the early 21st century. Okay. But before I get into that, I just want to present you with an image and give you an opportunity to respond to it. Some of you will perhaps recognise this. David, in his book overview, talked about advertising campaigns. This is a poster from an advertising campaign. I expect some of you recognise it, perhaps some of you don't. But I took this, it's actually in a bus shelter just around the corner from my house. And I'll just describe the image. I can tell you about the man in the image. His name's Joe Pachuch. He's 27, a Chelsea supporter, and likes William Shakespeare, especially Romeo and Juliet. He likes DJing, swimming, and has swum for Team GB. Football, cycling, boxing, drama and dancing. He's a pretty active guy. So this is taken, as you might imagine, from the campaign website. Joe also has Down syndrome, but that's just another thing that makes Joe Joe. And Joe is staring out at us directly from the at the camera or at us. He's face on. He is, you could say, frowning, perhaps grimacing. And he, although he's face on, his left shoulder is turned slightly towards the camera. His t-shirt is black, and contrasting against that, we've got his two hands, which are fingers up and palms inwards. And his left hand is slightly out in front of him towards the camera, and his right hand is more in towards his collarbone. So if you like, it's the classic boxer's pose. It's the classic, to me at least, it looks like the pose you strike when you invite someone for a fight, right? And that's how it looks to me. And then underneath it says, "Here I am, I'm not a learning disability." Sorry, what was that, Alan? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Put them up, kind of pose. So I don't want to say any more about that now. Oh, it's taken by Rankin as well, actually, the well-known fashion photographer Rankin, and he had this to say about it: "All too often we overlook people with a learning disability. It is so easy to miss the person and see a stereotype instead. With these images, I want people to see past the learning disability, to catch a glimpse of who each individual is and their personality and identity." So that's what Rankin, the photographer, had to say about it. And I thought I would just give you a couple of minutes to think about your own response to that image, whether you've seen it before or not. So I will just give you 2 minutes to do that, and then obviously if anybody wants to give some verbal feedback on your response to that image, then I would welcome that, but of course don't feel obliged. So 2 minutes on your tables, just to have a chat maybe, or a think about that image. Okay, I'm going to call time there. I'm going to call time there. Ria's got the mic. Would anyone like to volunteer an interpretation or opinion? I won't be offended if you don't. Oh, yeah, Joe. Oh, yeah.
First thing I'd like to say about it is I felt that he engaged with tropes of struggle in terms of disability. We're quite often depicted as fighting for things.
Yeah.
And he's kind of engaged with that.
Okay.
Also, without wishing to be funny or strange, he's quite a good looking chap.
Okay.
And it's quite an unapologetic image.
Yeah.
All those things apply to me.
Okay. Thank you very much. Joe, did you want to? Yeah.
And I was thinking that because of the way he is standing and looking at them, maybe that, he has to have downs, but I'm not weak.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a strong person, and that's what it's portraying.
Mm-hmm.
That's just my thought. I wasn't sure whether it was advertising something or just highlighting disability or difference.
Yeah, it is advertising something, but I don't want to say what yet if you don't already know. I expect some people have seen it before and know, but okay, thanks, Joe. Maybe one more if anybody wants to. Yeah, Rosie?
I thought it was kind of like freak shows.
Right.
It's like a non-disabled person taking a picture of a disabled person to display it to other non-disabled people.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That kind of felt like
So it feels a little bit more.
one updated version.
Okay.
I don't know if I just completely missed it.
Well, you know, as with any image, there are as many interpretations as there are viewers, I think. So, we've got a difference even within those three. I'm going to put the image aside for now, but we will come back to it later on once we get to the end of the talk. So now I'm going to get into the meat of it. So, like I say, I'm going to define this archipelago of confinement, sketch its origins, and then try and illustrate how it works. Okay, the archipelago of confinement. This, I'll just, the aims of the paper first. This paper aims to expose the ways in which, from the mid-19th century onwards, professions and institutions of confinement have both stoked and assuaged antipathy towards people with intellectual or cognitive impairments, and consequently profited as a result of the regime of truth they have helped to construct. Under this regime, people with intellectual impairments are represented as menacing or risky others. At the same time, the professions and institutions of confinement assume authority over, quote, the problem by relocating and segregating stigmatised individuals and assuring the public that the problem is under control. This move also provides some of these same professionals with captive populations for their own scientific, educational and capitalistic endeavours, which are geared towards either enabling people labelled with learning difficulties to approximate norms, or towards keeping them segregated from the population considered normal. These processes of measurement, classification and segregation bring into being new kinds of people through taxonomies established about perceived intellectual ability. In this way, as Foucault puts it, normalisation becomes one of the great instruments of power at the end of the classical age. And it continues to be one. The exact pattern of the discourse threads that intertwine to create the enclosing, excluding regime of truth evolve over time. But the fabric enveloping the discursive field in which truths about learning difficulties are scientifically established is never breached. James Trent wrote an excellent book called Inventing the Feeble Mind about asylums in America. Summarised it this way. From the time people with the thing, mental retardation, became social problems requiring help and treatment, the contours of this requirement have changed, sometimes dramatically. But the contours of our regard for people with mental retardation have not. This or that must be done to and for them. This and that must be learned about them and said about them to ensure progress in treatment technologies, professional influence, institutional funding, or social control. End quote. Snyder and Mitchell have defined cultural locations of disability as sites of violence, restriction, confinement, and the absence of liberty, where disabled people are deposited against their will, and which exist largely at odds with the collective and individual well-being of disabled people. In the 21st century, we can conceive of such locations forming what might be termed, again following Foucault, the carceral archipelago, that's Adams and Ereville's term, or from Spivakowski, the archipelago of confinement and control for people said to have learning difficulties. The islands of this archipelago are scattered across the globe and comprise a continuum of penal, medical and educational settings, hospitals, care homes, immigration detention centres, prisons, group homes, schools, youth detention centres, plus surveillance by professionals, doctors, psychologists, lawyers, educators and reams of digitised data. Previously, other locations, including farm schools, approved schools, reform schools, asylums, and what were called colonies, have also formed part of this archipelago. And that brings me to the image on the screen now. This is an image taken from James Trent's book. It's a drawing of Wrentham School for the Feeble-Minded in Massachusetts. And this is, the drawing was published in 1924, but I think the institution is actually older than that. It's an architect's drawing, so it is idealised to an extent, but it's a kind of landscape type image, or landscape format image. In the foreground and wrapping around three sides, we've got trees. And then in the background, in the far distance, there's hills, right? So we're clearly rural, right? We're away from the cities, we're away from the main population, we're out in the sticks, right? So there's segregation, isolation. And then the buildings themselves are very regimented, they're very square, they're very orderly, they're set out in a very regular pattern, much like a military camp. And we've got, clearly it's a kind of panoptic surveillance type in architecture, where people can be both kept, confined, and observed. So these are the kinds of locations that were there, or instituted at the beginning of the archipelago of confinement. The existence of this archipelago is a manifestation of the regime of truth around people deemed to have learning difficulties, who continue to be represented as menacing and risky others who must be contained and controlled by professionals for their own good, as well as to protect the wider public. So, the origins of the archipelago. We go back to the 1870s now, and the beginnings, the early decades of the asylums. On the screen, and I'll read it in a moment, are a couple of verses that were printed in early annual reports of the Royal Albert Asylum for Imbeciles and Idiots of the 7 northern counties. This was just outside Lancaster. I'll tell you more about it shortly. But for the moment, I just want to focus on the verses. So, these are the two verses that were printed in the annual reports. God help the imbecile. God help the imbecile, more dark their lot than dumb or deaf, the cripple or the blind. The closed soul vision theirs. The blighted mind. Babes though full grown. The page of life a blot. Yet say, shall their affliction be abhorred, their need o'erlooked, shall charity pass by, leave them to perish with averted eye, forbid the love that burns to save her, Lord. I'm not going to tell you what I think of that. Again, I'm going to stop and just give you a minute to perhaps digest that, and again, if you want to offer any responses, but again, I'll just give you 2 minutes with the verses, and then if you want to, a chance to respond. Now, by the 1910s, there was a palpable sense of official disillusionment and disappointment with the efficacy of education and training for patients. So in the UK, Lord Richard Cavendish, who was chairman of the Central Committee. Now, the Central Committee was the top administrative layer for asylums in the UK until they were incorporated into the NHS in 1948. So Lord Richard Cavendish, chairman of the Central Committee, said in a report to that committee in 1913, quote, "The early pioneers were too sanguine in supposing that a feeble-minded child could ever be made equal to a normal person. Experience has proved that lack of brain power can never be supplied. All that can be done is to train and make the best of whatever mental ability the patient may possess." And it's at this moment that we get a shift from this quite pathetic image of people with learning difficulties to a much more menacing one. And this helps to this helps to fuel the widespread popularity of eugenics. So we get professionals both stoking fear and loathing while also claiming authority over what has been called the problem of the unfit. And we can see this now in the quite literal invention of the moron. So, like many words which are currently used as insults, the moron began as a diagnostic term. So I'll speak now about the invention and the menace of the moron. Speaking of his studies of 19th century statistics, Ian Hacking contends that, quote, new slots were created in which to fit and enumerate people. Social change creates new categories of people, but counting is no mere report of developments. It creates new ways for people to be. So these technologies of counting are technologies of biopower. These new ways to be frame possibilities for agency and for control. There was a proliferation of these ways to be, flowing from what Hacking calls the avalanche of numbers, beginning in the early 19th century. An avalanche whose architects were particularly concerned with deviancy. Just as a physicist could make a previously unseen property of light perceptible by manipulating instruments to attain a particular effect, so the medical or educational professional could render visible a new kind of person by manipulating instruments, such as intelligence tests, in order to obtain particular results. The invention of the moron by Henry H. Goddard is a case in point, and particularly noteworthy because it was driven by overt, able nationalist, eugenicist concerns about the perceived threat presented to the health of nations by undesirables passing as normal within the general population. Intelligence testing was becoming widespread by the 1910s. Most influential was the Binet-Simon test, which was enthusiastically adopted and adapted by psychologists in the US. Henry H. Goddard quickly rose to prominence among this group owing to his position as head of research at the Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Boys and Girls in New Jersey, which enabled him to publish a series of scholarly papers and newspaper articles combining his interests in heredity, intelligence and social hygiene. Through manipulating the Binet-Simon test, Goddard created results which apparently confirmed the existence of a new category of feeble-mindedness, and he claimed that 2% of all school-aged children belonged in this category. Like the physicist adjusting the properties of his optical instruments to reveal a suspected, yet hitherto invisible property of light waves, Goddard's manoeuvre helped to bring into being a new kind of person who was held in many ways to resemble the normal, but was permanently, unimprovably mentally deficient. As such, this new kind of person represented a particular threat to social order because of their potential to pass unnoticed in the general population, combined with their purported propensity for crime and procreation. In this way, the moron, a name Goddard derived from the ancient Greek moros, meaning dull, was deliberately invented as a new slot in which people could fall and be counted, a new way for people to be, of low intelligence and a menace to society. So the US used the word moron. In the UK, we used the term moral imbecile and later moral defective, and they were defined like this. So these are the British definitions from the Royal Commission for the Care and Control of the Feeble-Minded, which were used till about the 1950s. A person who, by reason of innate defect, displays at an unusual... A person who, by reason of an innate defect, displays at an early age vicious or criminal propensities which are of an incorrigible or unusual nature, and are generally associated with some slight limitation of intellect. So the menace of the feeble-minded was principally the threat of millions of morons, most of whom were not in the institution. So as Michael Rembis noted in an earlier seminar, most people marked with intellectual impairments have not lived their lives in institutions, they've lived outside, because these institutions have only existed at particular moments and moments in time in particular spaces. So this creates a problem in the eugenicist position. How do you eliminate the feeble-minded when there are so many of them? So, for instance, when Goddard applied his IQ test to US military personnel, he got a result that showed apparently showed the average intelligence was that of a 12-year-old within people serving in the armed forces in the US, which to him suggested a very widespread level of feeble-mindedness. So, the problem for the eugenicist is, how do you eliminate the feeble-minded when there are so many of them? As we know, they were really advocating for three options: sterilisation, segregation, or extermination, which, as David touched on earlier, as we all know, reached its appalling nadir in the genocidal T4 Nazi programme. Not all institutional officials were eugenicists, but eugenicist thinking influenced policy. The institutional policy and response was to try and enforce segregation for that part of the population deemed most menacing. Total institutionalisation or warehousing of those thought to present the greatest threat to national fitness. Morons who were immoral, deviant and promiscuous. Criminals even though they had not yet committed any crime. And James Trent again sums this up very well with the quote I've got on the slide. They were out there, they were among us, and they were doing bad things. So, as a result of this, what we see both in the US and in the UK is a shift towards centralisation of services, increased control of people, increased length of stays, increased age at admission, and reduced emphasis on education and preparation for rejoining the outside world. So by way of illustration, the Royal Albert Asylum, in 1909, out of a total of 662 patients, 563, or 85%, were under the age of 15, so nearly all children. And only 8 patients, or 1.2%, were aged over 35. By 1948, and incorporation into the NHS, out of a total of 886 patients, 395, or 44.5%, were over 35. So that's from 1.2%, i.e. hardly any of them, to getting on for a half in the space of 40 years. A huge shift towards containing adults. And by 1948, only 12% were children, only 12% were under 15, whereas it had been 85% before. So it's a massive switch. Now, I've been privileged enough to be able to access some of the patient records from the Royal Albert, and I'm going to share some of that information with you now. It took me quite a lot of negotiation to be able to access these records, and much as I would like to tell you people's names, I can't. I'm not allowed to identify anyone. So what you're actually going to see is a composite of various different records. But this is the kind of thing that was recorded about people. What's on the screen now is just a photograph of the front of one of the ledgers, one of the admission books. Is a huge leather-bound ledgers. They are probably 50 centimetres by 30 centimetres. And obviously twice as wide when you open it out double page. They're massive things. And in them you can see these kinds of things. So in the top right-hand corner there, these hand-drawn genealogies, a hand-drawn family tree for a patient. And they would very carefully note the patient's family characteristics. So there are notes like, for instance, aunt is insane, or from somebody else, father fell off a ladder, mother had a fright in pregnancy. They would note all of these things down, often quite vague. They're particularly interested in what they were calling, I don't know if I can say this consanguineous marriages and family, inbreeding, right? They were particularly worried about that. So we got lots of photographs of patients would often be included. That was obviously a new technology at the time. And then we have, in the bottom right-hand corner, those are someone's BNA CMON test results, right? Hand-drawn test results from an intelligence test. It says, the description underneath says, can tell the time to 5-minute intervals, but cannot convert hands to show 13 minutes to 2. Can spell some words, but not others. I can't quite read them from here. I've forgotten what they are. Can spell some words from not others. And there's a judgment in the right-hand column, which says status imbecile, spelt wrongly, which I think is great. So those are the kinds of things that you get in the registers, and then very detailed notes about them on their state of admission. So we get things like general aspect, which would include things like ordinary, frail, mongoloid, paralytic, or just rather thin. Notes on their complexion, their appearance and manners. That might include one which I noted was typical of class, which I thought was quite interesting. Temper and disposition, propensities, notes on any deformity, and then physical measurements as well. So, for instance, you get this strange mix of the intimate and the coy in a lot of them. So one patient is described under propensities as apt to romance, which seems rather coy, because a few lines down it describes in great detail the size and shape of her genitals, which means that some kind of intimate physical investigation has obviously taken place. So these are the technologies of abnormality that Foucault talks about. These are the technologies of surveillance, of power, of knowledge. And also in the ledgers we get these very detailed, sometimes page after page after page of case notes. I've just briefly flashed up one of them there. You can see this goes on for many, many years. These are the notes of a patient who spent 30 years and ultimately died in the institution. Okay, so I'll move on. From the 1920s, eugenics began to lose respectability, and after World War II and T4, there was a major change in attitudes. However, the idea that the most severely disabled, putting that in scare quotes, or most hopeless cases ought to be segregated persisted, even through the move towards policies of normalisation and care in the community. So what I've done so far is concentrate on a period up to 100 years ago and establishing the archipelago. And now I'm going to shift into talking about how it operates today. In 2011, the BBC's investigative current affairs programme Panorama exposed systematic abuse and neglect of people labelled with learning difficulties at the Winterbourne View Hospital, of the kind that was supposedly consigned to history with the demise of the asylums. More recently, the Justice for LB campaign, which highlighted the death of Connor Sparrowhawk, nicknamed Laughing Boy, who drowned in the bath because of inadequate supervision at the hospital that was supposed to be caring for him, has kept the spotlight on these inhumane practices. Despite convictions in the Winterbourne View case and an ensuing government inquiry aimed at ensuring that the physical and psychological abuse of people with learning difficulties that took place at Winterbourne View could never take place again, we are continually presented with evidence of the segregation, maltreatment, and exploitation of people labelled with learning difficulties. The recent Leader Review of England concluded that they not only experienced significant health inequalities and premature mortality, but delays in care or treatment, gaps in service provision, organisational dysfunction, and neglect or abuse that often impacted on their health. Meanwhile, in June 2017, 13 directors, managers and carers were convicted of abuse at 2 residential homes in Devon, both isolated farmhouses for adults labelled with learning difficulties. One such resident had been moved from Winterbourne. One of those convicted was the founder of the company running the homes and is a well-known figure in mental health circles in the UK, having helped to formulate national policy on caring for people with learning difficulties in the community. He told the court he did not know what was going on. However, as at the Royal Albert, residents were punished for trivial transgressions, including staring at a staff member, facial twitches, or asking questions repeatedly. Sometimes residents were punished by being denied food, drink, fun activities and visits. At others, they were confined in bare seclusion rooms for hours and sometimes overnight, on occasions wetting or soiling themselves because there were no bathroom facilities. One resident described his experiences so. It was a room that was disgusting and cold. At night, the door was locked. It had a CCTV camera, a smoke detector, and a punctured mattress. It was an airbed, but it had a puncture in it. It was cold, damp. If you wanted to go to the toilet, there was no toilet in there. There was a window, but it was locked. No curtains. They made the room as bad as possible and as uncomfortable as possible. It made me feel terrible in a way, an animal basically. The company running the homes, Atlas Project Team, claimed to provide specialist care for learning disabled people at a cost of £4,000 per week per person. Yet this is not an isolated incident, a single rogue institution operating outside the law. Rather, the case is representative of national and international ableist projects of confinement and abuse under the euphemistic guise of managing risky individuals with challenging behaviour and, quote, complex needs. So the Trade in People report came out last year. I expect some of you, or was it earlier this year? Anyway, recently, I expect some of you read it. And they talked about the amount of money that is generated through this confinement. So in the UK, and these figures come from the government's own statistics, reinterpreted by Brown, James and Hatton. In the UK in 2015-16, £477.4 million was spent, i.e. went to private companies mainly, in keeping approximately 2,500 people labelled with learning difficulties in hospitals. Just over half those beds are provided by the private sector, and that sector has grown massively. Worth noting that patients detained in the private sector are 30% more likely to experience an assault and 60% more likely to be detained than those in the NHS. This market is estimated, this trade in people, to be worth £284 million a year to the private sector. And on average, a person who has been in hospital for 5 years will generate £950,000, nearly £1 million, for an independent sector organisation. Here's a story from the Trade in People report from a parent of somebody kept in one of these private institutions. One morning, my son was made to attend a meeting with other patients. He tolerated this for a while, but was then asked to leave. A support worker told him he couldn't, so my son, in a panic, struck the support worker. This same worker retaliated by grabbing him, forcing his arm up behind his back, and manhandling him out of the room. When I went to visit later, I noticed my son's arm was badly swollen, and I asked about this. The next morning, the manager rang me and said that she had been organising for him, that's the son, to go to A&E, because his arm was still swollen. An X-ray revealed that his humerus was badly broken, and that the break was compatible with having someone having their arm forced up behind their back. This bone is one of the thickest in the human body, and therefore quite difficult to break. Excuse me. So people with learning difficulties are being confined and maltreated not simply because of the supposed risk or menace that they present. Privatization and the logic of the market means they're being traded like livestock in orders that providers and health authorities can maximise operational efficiency and minimise economic costs. This frequently leads people with learning difficulties to be sent to archipelago locations far distant from their homes and families and unable to access support once they become entitled to leave, as bureaucrats, accountants and managers argue over who should pay for what. These are quotes from annual reports that some of these organisations publish, and they quite unabashedly use the language of the market and commerce in describing what they do. So the first one is from Southampton, Hampshire, Isle of Wight and Portsmouth Transforming Care Partnership, or SHIP TCP. SHIP TCP is a net importer of people with learning difficulties plus a net exporter of inpatients, as there are no beds on Portsea Island. And then from Northamptonshire. Northamptonshire is a county with several large providers, and this has created an importer concern. St Andrews is a large independent provider of services for people with learning disabilities. The hospital is in the process of expanding with a new 100-bed service for people with autism, which is a significant concern from the CCGs from an economic and value-based perspective. Brown, James and Hatton sum it up quite neatly, I think. Most of that provision operates on a for-profit basis, and our sons and daughters are its currency. And these stories are dispersed throughout the archipelago of confinement. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of the case of Dylan Voller. Dylan Voller was an Australian Aboriginal, an Australian Aboriginal teenager, and footage of him was broadcast by ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, a couple of years ago. And it included the image which is on the screen now, which is of Dylan hooded, strapped to a chair inside the detention centre. And there's some transcript that was also of what was broadcast. I know I can't read it from now, I'll just quickly go through it. So the guard, you can't just put toilet paper everywhere, you can't you can't start chewing your mattress, you can't do that stuff. So he's being punished for chewing his mattress and ripping up some toilet paper. He's wearing the hood because he has spat at staff before, and so that's the response, to put that hood on him. You can't lock Dylan, you can't lock me in here, bros. Guard, unfortunately you've put yourself in here by going at risk. You've put yourself in here by going at risk. Guard, might get the restraint chair possibly as well. Voller, I don't want the restraint chair, bro. Voller, where's my fucking mattress? I'm not a dog to you. Guard, you need to settle down. Voller, I'm going to break my hand anyway. Guard, why are you going to break your hand? Voller, so I can go to hospital. And then something inaudible. Guard, well, you won't go. I doubt very much you'll go to hospital. Voller, I'll snap my bone through my skin. All right. Guard, all right, we'll just give you the heads up. Grab the restraint chair. We are going in the restraint chair. And in he goes. And he's left like that for several hours, often on his own. So, and again, this is a headline-making case, but the evidence suggests that this is not an isolated case. So people labelled with learning difficulties are routinely being subjected to oppressive, inhumane and degrading treatment for extended, if not indefinite periods. Yet they are not the only ones paying the price for what those of us outside the archipelago and under the auspices of able nationalism tend to regard as freedom. The interlocking discourses of policy, legislation, corporate strategy and professional street-level bureaucrats or frontline workers lead those workers inexorably into conceptualising the people in their care as risks to be managed, as clearly is the case with the guard here. People labelled with learning difficulties are constituted as risks to the wider society, to themselves and to staff and to profits. This results in restrictive practices which have legislative approval only as measures of last resort, becoming normalised and commonplace. Such practices include the administration of drugs approved for short-term use for years at a time, in addition to seclusion, so-called aversive technologies. These include inflicting pain, electric shocks, and the forced inhalation of ammonia, as well as the kinds of physical restraint performed on Dylan Voller. A paradox these workers face is that although able nationalism aims to produce prudent workers with enhanced responsibility, it also provides the framework and mechanisms necessary to blame, penalise and ultimately remove from the workforce anybody who is deemed to be acting irresponsibly, in order that organisational reputation and profit are not put at risk. Acting irresponsibly includes workers putting their own health and safety at risk. In an institution where people are frequently violent, or where violence is perceived to be a constant threat, workers respond to this threat to their health and safety, and hence their continued employment, by enacting restrictive practices as a matter of course, all in the name of managing risk. And one worker in Spivakowski's 2017 study is quite clear about this, and I quote, "The problem is that a lot of this stuff makes it easier for workers and sometimes safer for workers, keeping people under control. And I think that means things like workplace health and safety can be used as a technique for maintaining coercion and control." My point here is that employees as well as residents, inmates, patients, find themselves constrained by a discursive regime of truth which constructs people labelled with learning difficulties as risky others. The power of able nationalism is exerted through relationships between, inter alia, these two groups, with the concept of learning difficulties constituting workers as moral agents, protecting everyone from risk and hence harm, whose apparent freedom to act is in fact confined within the very limited space of possibilities afforded by current and historical, political, legal and medical discourses. Of course, disabled people are subjugated to an immeasurably greater degree by this power, and yet able nationalism denigrates us all. So, just to return to the image of Joe. Some of you may know that this came from a campaign by MenCap, the charity MenCap. And I've mentioned Dylan Voller and I've mentioned the case of Connor Sparrowhawk. Now I mentioned another case, a man called Danny Tozer, whose inquest recently closed. In 2015, Danny Tozer died as a result of cardiac arrest following an epileptic fit in supported living accommodation run by MenCap. His family had to fight for an inquest, otherwise the death would not have been investigated. Although the inquest concluded that Danny died of natural causes, his support plan was not fully followed on the day he died. And the family believed the evidence heard during this inquest painted a picture of confused and inconsistent support, a lack of monitoring, no overall coordination, and an absence of leadership. No one person or agency was prepared to take responsibility for Danny's care. It was also questioned as to whether the seizure alarm in Danny's bed was working properly on the night he died. So what do we make of the image of Joe used by MenCap in a national advertising campaign? It's deliberately, I think, confrontational. It perhaps could even be described as menacing. At the same time, it is helping MenCap generate profile and income in order to run places of confinement like the one Danny Tozer died in. And that's all I have to say. But I would, I know seems like a bit of a shame to finish on such a negative note, but I think it would be worth, I said I would return to this image at the end, and I have, and I think it's perhaps just worth having a moment to reflect on what it is and what it means and what it represents. So I don't have a formal conclusion, but thank you very much for listening.